Picture this. A gentle art student gets cornered by the most vicious bullies in school and forced to swallow handfuls of filthy mud while thousands watch online. But here's the twist that will blow your mind. She's not just any quiet girl hiding behind oversized glasses. She's a former elite bodyguard, trained by one of the world's most secretive protection agencies, capable of neutralizing threats with surgical precision. These bullies just humiliated the deadliest teenager in Oregon, and they have absolutely no idea what's coming for them. Get ready for the most incredible story of hidden power and explosive justice you've ever witnessed. This tale will have you questioning everyone around you, because sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones you'd never suspect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind swept across the sprawling campus of Riverside Valley High School in Millbrook, Oregon, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of another dreary Pacific Northwest afternoon. This wasn't one of those pristine, suburban schools you see in movies, with perfectly manicured lawns and state-of-the-art facilities. Riverside Valley was a study in contrasts, where gleaming new athletic buildings stood next to crumbling classroom wings that hadn't seen renovation since the 1980s. The student parking lot told the whole story: luxury SUVs and brand new sports cars clustered near the main entrance, while beat-up sedans and rusty pickup trucks were relegated to the far corners near the maintenance buildings. In this carefully orchestrated social ecosystem, reputation meant everything, and vulnerability was blood in the water. The school's administration had long ago given up trying to control the complex web of social hierarchies that governed student life, instead focusing their energy on maintaining test scores and avoiding scandals that might threaten their funding. It was the perfect environment for predators to thrive, as long as they were smart enough to keep their activities away from cameras and adult supervision. Emma Rodriguez understood this delicate balance better than most, which was why she had spent the past 2 years perfecting the art of invisibility. At 17, she had mastered the precise movements required to navigate Riverside Valley's corridors without drawing attention, head down but not too low, pace steady but never hurried, always carrying a sketchbook or worn paperback novel to signal her harmless artistic nature. Her curly brown hair was perpetually pulled back in a messy bun, secured with whatever writing instrument was handy, and her oversized glasses served the dual purpose of correcting her vision while creating a barrier between herself and the world around her. Most students at Riverside Valley couldn't even remember Emma's last name, which was exactly how she preferred it. She had learned through painful experience that anonymity was the ultimate protection, far more reliable than any weapon or fighting technique. Every morning, she would slip through the school's basement entrance near the art wing, avoiding the main hallways where the social elite conducted their daily rituals of establishing dominance and selecting victims. Her sanctuary was an abandoned art classroom in the school's lowest level, a forgotten space that Mr. Peterson, the overworked art teacher, had unofficially allowed her to use during lunch periods and free hours. The room smelled of old paint and clay dust, with north-facing windows that provided perfect natural light for sketching. Here, surrounded by easels covered in drop cloths and shelves lined with unused canvases, Emma could almost pretend she was just another artistic teenager struggling with normal problems, like college applications and weekend plans. But Emma Rodriguez was anything but normal, carrying secrets that would have shattered the mundane reality of Riverside Valley High School if they were ever revealed. Behind those oversized glasses were eyes that had been trained to assess threats in microseconds, to identify escape routes and improvised weapons in any environment. Her seemingly delicate hands, often stained with charcoal or paint, possessed the muscle memory to disable an attacker in a dozen different ways. The loose-fitting hoodies and worn jeans she favored weren't just typical teenage fashion choices. They were carefully selected to conceal the lean, powerful physique of someone who had once been considered among the most promising young operatives in an organization most people would never know existed. 3 years earlier, Emma had been known by a different name in circles that operated far from the safety of suburban high schools. As Nightingale, she had been the youngest member ever inducted into the Shadow Guard, an elite protection agency that specialized in safeguarding high-value targets in the world's most dangerous situations. While other 13-year-olds were worried about middle school dances and friendship drama, Emma had been learning advanced combat techniques from former Special Forces operators and intelligence agents who had seen action in conflicts across the globe. The Shadow Guard didn't recruit through traditional channels. They identified candidates through a complex network of contacts in law enforcement, military, and diplomatic circles, looking for young people who had demonstrated exceptional potential. Combined with tragic circumstances that left them without strong family connections, Emma had fit their profile perfectly after her parents, both career diplomats, were killed in a terrorist attack on a United Nations facility in Somalia. With no immediate family willing or able to care for her, and displaying remarkable composure and intelligence in the aftermath of the tragedy, she had become an ideal candidate for the Guard's unconventional training program. For 3 years, Emma had lived a life that would have been incomprehensible to her current classmates at Riverside Valley. Her days began before dawn with intensive physical conditioning that pushed her small frame to its absolute limits. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu sessions taught her how to use leverage and technique to overcome opponents twice her size, while Krav Maga training drilled into her the ruthless efficiency needed to neutralize threats before they could escalate. Weapons training covered everything from traditional firearms to improvised implements, always with an emphasis on the split-second decision-making required in protection scenarios. But the Shadow Guard's training went far beyond physical preparation. Emma learned to read micro-expressions and body language, to detect deception and assess the psychological state of potential threats. She studied architecture and urban planning to understand how buildings and public spaces could be used tactically. Language instruction gave her conversational ability in 6 languages, while technology courses taught her to operate sophisticated surveillance and communication equipment. Most importantly, she learned the Guard's core philosophy: the best protection was invisible protection. Their clients lived normal lives, attended public events, and traveled freely precisely because Shadow Guard operatives could blend seamlessly into any environment while maintaining constant vigilance. Emma discovered she had a natural talent for this kind of work, able to project an image of harmless vulnerability while simultaneously cataloging every potential threat in her vicinity. Her specialty became close-quarters protection for high-risk diplomatic families, particularly situations involving children and teenagers who needed to maintain some semblance of normal life despite constant danger. Emma's youthful appearance and natural artistic abilities made her perfect for assignments where she could pose as a fellow student or young family friend, providing protection that was both highly effective and completely invisible to outside observers. For 3 years, this life had given Emma purpose and belonging. The Shadow Guard became her family, and she threw herself into their missions with the dedication of someone who had found her calling. Her handlers praised her natural instincts and rapid skill development, often comparing her favorably to operatives. With decades more experience, she began to believe that she had found her place in the world, that the terrible tragedy of her parents' death had led her to something meaningful. Everything changed during what should have been a routine assignment: protecting the teenage daughter of a Brazilian ambassador who had received credible death threats. Emma, operating under the cover identity of an exchange student, had been providing close protection for 16-year-old Maria Santos as she attended a prestigious boarding school in Switzerland. The mission had been proceeding flawlessly for 6 months when intelligence reports indicated an imminent kidnapping attempt by a criminal organization with connections to the same terrorist group responsible for her parents' deaths. The Shadow Guard's response protocols called for immediate extraction of both the principal and the operative, but Emma made a decision that would haunt her for years to come. Believing she could neutralize the threat before it materialized, she chose to deviate from established procedures and attempt to eliminate the kidnappers before they could act. Her plan was tactically sound and demonstrated the advanced thinking her trainers had always praised, but it failed to account for the psychological impact of facing the same organization that had destroyed her family. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When the moment came to act, Emma hesitated for just a fraction of a second, distracted by memories of her parents and a sudden overwhelming desire for personal revenge rather than professional duty. That hesitation created an opening that the kidnappers exploited, resulting in a chaotic firefight that left Maria Santos wounded and Emma's cover completely blown. Although both girls survived and the kidnappers were eventually captured, the mission was classified as a catastrophic failure. Due to Emma's deviation from protocol and the unnecessary endangerment of her principal, the aftermath was swift and devastating. Emma's handler, Agent Marcus Sullivan, who had served as both mentor and father figure during her time with the Guard, was held responsible for the mission failure and faced severe disciplinary action. The investigation revealed that Emma had been struggling with unresolved trauma from her parents' death, making her unsuitable for continued active duty. The Shadow Guard's leadership, faced with an operative who could no longer be trusted to follow orders and who possessed intimate knowledge of their methods and personnel, considered several options for dealing with the situation. In the end, Agent Sullivan convinced them to allow Emma to simply disappear. Her death was staged in a climbing accident in the Swiss Alps, complete with enough physical evidence to satisfy any investigation while leaving no recoverable body. Meanwhile, the real Emma was provided with a new identity and quietly relocated to live with her mother's sister in Oregon, a woman who had never been close to Emma's family and knew nothing about her niece's true history. Aunt Sarah Rodriguez was a former military nurse who had spent 20 years working in VA hospitals before retiring to the quiet town of Millbrook. She was a kind but practical woman who asked few questions and seemed content to provide a stable home for her orphaned niece without prying too deeply into the traumatic circumstances that had brought Emma to her door. The cover story painted Emma as a troubled teenager who had been living in various foster homes since her parents' diplomatic work had made permanent guardianship arrangements complicated. For 2 years, Emma had thrown herself into the role of normal teenager with the same dedication she had once applied to Shadow Guard missions. She studied normal teenage behavior with the intensity of deep cover preparation, learning to mimic the casual concerns and social dynamics of high school life. The artistic talents that had once been useful for maintaining cover identities became a genuine passion, providing both an outlet for her complex emotions and a perfectly normal explanation for her preference for solitude. But maintaining the facade was exhausting in ways that combat training had never been. Every day required constant vigilance to suppress instincts that had been drilled into her through years of intensive conditioning. When someone approached her unexpectedly, her first impulse was still to assess their potential as a threat and identify the most efficient way to neutralize them. The cafeteria's chaotic environment triggered automatic tactical analysis of sightlines and escape routes. Even simple interactions with classmates required careful monitoring to ensure she didn't reveal knowledge or capabilities that would be impossible for a normal teenager to possess. The hardest part was the loneliness. At Riverside Valley, Emma was surrounded by hundreds of teenagers, but she couldn't form genuine connections with any of them without risking exposure of her true identity. Every conversation had to be carefully managed, every reaction calculated to maintain her cover. She watched her classmates navigate normal teenage dramas and relationships with a mixture of envy and bewilderment, knowing that she could never participate in that kind of normal life without putting everyone around her in potential danger. This was the delicate balance Emma had maintained for 2 years as she moved through her junior year at Riverside Valley High School. She had successfully convinced herself that she could build a new life as long as she kept her head down and avoided drawing attention. The shadow guard believed she was dead, her aunt was content with their quiet relationship, and her classmates barely knew she existed. It was a sustainable situation that could potentially last until graduation and beyond, allowing her to eventually disappear into college life and perhaps find some measure of normal happiness. But Emma had failed to account for one crucial variable in her carefully constructed new life: the predatory instincts of teenagers who viewed vulnerability as an invitation to establish dominance. Despite all her training in threat assessment and protective protocols, she had underestimated the danger posed by her own classmates, particularly those who had built their social status on the systematic humiliation of anyone they perceived as weak or different. At the apex of Riverside Valley's social hierarchy sat Victoria Matthews, known to everyone as Tori, a 17-year-old who had weaponized her natural intelligence and strategic thinking in the service of maintaining absolute social control. Unlike the stereotypical mean girl who relied primarily on physical appearance and family wealth, Tori was a master manipulator who understood exactly how to exploit the complex dynamics of teenage social structures to maintain her position of power. As head cheerleader and student council president, Tori occupied official positions that gave her legitimate authority while providing perfect cover for her more ruthless activities. She was beautiful in the way that magazines define beauty: blonde hair that always looked professionally styled, a figure maintained through obsessive attention to diet and exercise, and a wardrobe that managed to be both expensive and perfectly appropriate for the school's dress code. But her real power came from her ability to read people and identify exactly what they wanted or feared most, then use that knowledge to control them. Tori's boyfriend, Tyler Brooks, provided the muscle for her operations while serving as the perfect accessory for her public image. At 6'3" and built like the star basketball player he was, Tyler commanded respect through physical presence and the implied threat of violence. He wasn't particularly intelligent, but he possessed the kind of casual cruelty that made him perfect for Tori's purposes. His explosive temper and willingness to use physical intimidation allowed Tori to maintain plausible deniability while ensuring that her targets understood the consequences of resistance. The third member of their core group was Madison Clark, a petite brunette whose innocent appearance masked a vicious streak that even impressed Tori. Madison's obsession with social media had made her the group's documentation specialist, always ready with her phone to capture humiliating moments that could be weaponized later. Her Instagram account boasted 15,000 followers who eagerly consumed the carefully curated content she produced, including subtle mockery of less popular students that generated engagement through shared cruelty. Together, this trio had perfected a system of psychological warfare that kept the entire student body in a state of anxious submission. They were careful to avoid actions that might trigger adult intervention, instead focusing on a campaign of steady erosion that left their victims isolated and helpless. Public humiliation was their specialty, delivered with enough plausible deniability that complaints to teachers or administrators could be dismissed as normal teenage conflict or misunderstandings. For 2 years, Emma had successfully avoided their attention through careful application of the invisibility technique she had learned during her shadow guard training. But as her junior year progressed and college applications began dominating student conversations, the social dynamics at Riverside Valley started shifting in subtle ways that made her previous strategies less effective. Tori, facing the reality that her high school kingdom would soon end, had become increasingly aggressive in asserting her dominance, looking for new targets to ensure that her final year would be remembered as the pinnacle of her power. Emma's mistake was allowing herself a moment of genuine human connection that revealed just enough personality to attract predatory attention. During a particularly difficult art assignment that had frustrated several students, she had quietly helped a younger classmate understand the shading techniques required for their project. It was a small act of kindness that should have been completely unremarkable, but it demonstrated competence and confidence that didn't quite fit with her carefully maintained image of helpless vulnerability. Madison, who had been struggling with the same assignment, had noticed Emma's artistic ability and mentioned it to Tori as an example of how some people were secretly showing off their talents. To most people, this would have been an insignificant observation, but Tori's predatory instincts immediately identified something worth investigating. Emma Rodriguez, the girl who barely existed in the social ecosystem of Riverside Valley High School, had somehow developed skills that suggested hidden depths beneath her carefully maintained facade. That observation had put Emma on Tori's radar for the first time, leading to subtle surveillance that revealed other small inconsistencies in her presentation. The way she moved through crowded hallways with unusual spatial awareness, never quite bumping into other students or getting caught in the chaotic flow patterns that trapped everyone else. Her posture, which most people would describe as shy or withdrawn, actually demonstrated the kind of balanced readiness that suggested athletic training far beyond what her apparent lifestyle would provide. Most tellingly, her reactions to sudden loud noises or unexpected movement revealed split-second assessment behaviors that didn't match her image as a scattered artistic type. None of these observations would have meant anything to a normal teenager. But Tori Matthews possessed the kind of intuitive understanding of human behavior that made her such an effective predator. She recognized that Emma Rodriguez was performing a role rather than simply being herself, and that recognition triggered both curiosity and competitive instincts that would prove catastrophic for everyone involved. The decision to target Emma wasn't made suddenly or carelessly. Tori spent weeks conducting what amounted to intelligence gathering, using her network of followers and admirers to collect information about Emma's routines, relationships, and potential vulnerabilities. The investigation revealed a girl with no close friends, no documented romantic history, and no apparent family connections beyond an aunt who worked at the local VA hospital. Perfect victim material, isolated, seemingly helpless, and unlikely to have anyone willing or able to intervene on her behalf. But Tori's analysis had missed the most crucial detail about her chosen target. Emma Rodriguez might have looked like easy prey, but she was actually the most dangerous person at Riverside Valley High School, carrying skills and experience that would have been sufficient to neutralize every threat on campus without breaking a sweat. The quiet girl who spent her lunch periods sketching in an abandoned art room was a former elite operative who had been trained to protect diplomats and politicians in war zones around the world. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shatter the carefully maintained illusion of normal teenage life at Riverside Valley High School, revealing truths that none of the participants were prepared to handle. Emma's 2-year experiment in normal life was about to end in the most explosive way possible, and the consequences would reach far beyond the suburban boundaries of Millbrook, Oregon. The October afternoon carried an unusual chill as Emma Rodriguez made her way across the campus quad toward the community service meeting point behind the gymnasium. Riverside Valley High School required 20 hours of community service for graduation, and Emma had chosen the least social option available, campus beautification, which mostly involved picking up trash and pulling weeds in areas where regular students rarely ventured. It was perfect for maintaining her low profile while fulfilling the requirement that would keep her on track for graduation. She adjusted the straps of her worn backpack, checking to make sure her sketchbook was secure. Inside, the art supplies she carried everywhere had become as essential to her cover identity as the oversized glasses that constantly slipped down her nose. Every prop mattered when you were living a carefully constructed lie, and Emma had learned to think of her entire persona as a performance that required constant attention to detail. The maintenance area behind the gymnasium was exactly as uninviting as Emma had hoped when she signed up for this particular service project. Concrete loading docks, industrial dumpsters, and a small equipment shed created a maze of shadows and corners that most students would find depressing. The supervising teacher, Mrs. Henderson, was a tired-looking woman in her 50s who seemed grateful to have any volunteers at all and asked no questions about why Emma preferred to work alone. In the least desirable areas, Emma had been systematically cleaning the drainage ditches that ran along the building's foundation, a task that was both genuinely helpful and perfectly suited to someone who wanted to avoid social interaction. The work was meditative in its repetition, allowing her mind to drift while her hands stayed busy with the familiar motions of collecting debris and sorting recyclables from genuine trash. It was during these quiet moments that she sometimes allowed herself to remember her previous life, carefully examining memories of shadow guard training to identify skills that might be transferable to normal civilian existence. She was crouched beside a particularly clogged drain, using an improvised tool fashioned from a broken ruler to extract a tangle of leaves and plastic bottles, when she heard the distinctive sound of expensive sneakers on concrete. The footsteps were deliberately casual, the kind of calculated approach that suggested predators trying to appear non-threatening while positioning themselves for an attack. Emma's training kicked in automatically, her peripheral vision cataloging the approaching figures while her conscious mind maintained focus on the task at hand. 3 people, moving in a loose formation that blocked potential escape routes. The leader was female, approximately 5'6", wearing designer athletic wear that suggested both wealth and the kind of physical fitness that came from vanity, rather than functional training. Her companions were a larger male and a smaller female, both maintaining positions that indicated they were following the leader's directions rather than acting independently. Classic pack behavior with clear hierarchy and established roles. Emma's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to continue working on the drain. 2 years of normal teenage life had taught her that sometimes the best defense was to appear completely oblivious to social dynamics, giving potential aggressors the opportunity to reconsider their approach without losing face. It was a strategy that had worked countless times before, allowing her to avoid confrontations that might have revealed her true capabilities. But as the footsteps drew closer, Emma realized that this situation was different. The approaching students weren't the usual opportunistic bullies looking for a quick thrill. They moved with purpose and coordination that suggested careful planning, and their choice of location demonstrated strategic thinking that made Emma's stomach clench with growing dread. This wasn't a random encounter. It was an ambush. Well, look what we have here, came a voice that was perfectly modulated to project authority without quite crossing the line into obvious aggression. Emma recognized the speaker immediately, though they had never actually spoken before. Victoria Matthews, the undisputed queen of Riverside Valley's social hierarchy, had finally decided to acknowledge Emma's existence. Emma looked up slowly, her hands still gripping the improvised cleaning tool as she assessed the situation with the kind of tactical analysis that had once kept diplomats alive in war zones. Tori Matthews stood directly in front of her, backlit by the afternoon sun, in a way that was probably calculated to create maximum intimidation. Her perfectly styled blonde hair caught the light like a halo, but her expression was anything but angelic. Tyler Brooks loomed to her left, his basketball player's build making him appear even larger in the confined space between the buildings. Madison Clark positioned herself to Emma's right, already holding her phone in a way that suggested she was prepared to record whatever was about to happen. Emma Rodriguez, right? Tori continued, her tone suggesting friendly interest that didn't match the predatory gleam in her eyes. I've been meaning to talk to you. You're always so busy with your little art projects and cleaning duties. Very dedicated." Emma straightened slowly, her movements careful and deliberate as she tried to buy time to think. Every instinct screamed at her to assess the threat level and respond accordingly, but she couldn't afford to reveal the kind of tactical awareness that would raise questions about her background. Instead, she had to play the role of confused, vulnerable teenager who didn't understand what was happening. "I'm just finishing up here," Emma said quietly, her voice carrying exactly the right note of nervous uncertainty. "Mrs. Henderson wants this area cleaned before the end of the week." Madison giggled, a sound that carried malicious undertones that made Emma's skin crawl. "Oh, you're going to be so much cleaner when we're done with you," she said, her phone now obviously recording as she moved to get a better angle. Emma's mind raced through possible responses, each one evaluated and discarded as too revealing of her true nature. She could have disarmed all three of them before they realized what was happening, but that would end her carefully constructed normal life in the most dramatic way possible. She could try to de-escalate through conversation, but Torai's body language suggested that this confrontation had been planned too carefully to be derailed by mere words. The truth was that Emma had been dreading this moment for 2 years, knowing that eventually her luck would run out and she would face exactly this kind of situation. Her shadow guard training had covered dozens of scenarios involving protection of principals in hostile social environments, but none of those protocols applied when you were trying to maintain deep cover as a normal teenager. The skills that had once made her one of the most promising young operatives in the world had become liabilities that could destroy everything she had worked to build. "You know what I think?" Torai said, taking a step closer with the kind of predatory confidence that suggested she had done this many times before. "I think you've been hiding from us, skulking around in basements and back alleys, pretending to be so innocent and artistic. But I've been watching you, Emma. There's something different about you." Emma's blood ran cold at those words. If Torai had been conducting surveillance, there was no telling what she might have observed. Even the most careful operative could make mistakes when maintaining cover for extended periods, and Emma had been living this lie for 2 years. A moment of inattention, a reflexive response to unexpected stimuli, a brief lapse in her performed helplessness, any of these could have provided clues to someone with the intelligence and motivation to look carefully. "I don't know what you mean," Emma said, but even as the words left her mouth she knew they sounded weak and unconvincing. Her voice carried a tremor that was only partially performed, betraying genuine fear that had nothing to do with physical danger and everything to do with the possibility of exposure. Tyler cracked his knuckles, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the enclosed space. "She's lying," he said with the kind of certainty that suggested he was used to intimidating people into submission. "Look at her. She's scared, but not scared. Enough, normal people would be crying by now." Emma realized with growing horror that Tyler was right. Her shadow guard training had conditioned her to remain calm under pressure, but that very composure was now working against her. A normal teenager facing this kind of coordinated intimidation would indeed be more visibly frightened. Her ability to maintain emotional control, once her greatest asset, had become evidence of her deception. Madison moved closer, her phone camera capturing every angle as she provided running commentary that Emma realized was probably being live-streamed to her social media followers. "This is so crazy, you guys. We're just trying to be friendly with the weird art girl, and she's acting like we're going to hurt her or something. So paranoid." The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. Madison was creating a narrative in real time, painting Emma as the aggressor for the benefit of her online audience, while simultaneously documenting what was clearly going to be a humiliating assault. It was a level of calculated malice that impressed Emma even as it filled her with dread. "Here's what I think happened," Torai said, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a carefully prepared speech. "I think little Emma here has been contaminating our beautiful campus with her presence. Look at this mess she's made, stirring up all this dirty water and garbage. She's turned our school into a swamp." Emma glanced down at the drainage ditch she had been cleaning, seeing it suddenly through Torai's twisted perspective. The work she had been doing was genuinely helpful, clearing blockages that would prevent flooding during the winter rains. But Torai was reframing it as destructive behavior, creating a justification for whatever she was planning to do. "I was just cleaning up the drainage system," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Henderson asked me to." "Mrs. Henderson isn't here," Tyler interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of menace that suggested he was enjoying this far too much. "It's just us and your mess. And I think you should take responsibility for what you've done." Emma's heart hammered as she realized where this was heading. The muddy water she had been draining from the clogged system had pooled in several spots around the work area, creating patches of thick, contaminated slurry that contained everything from decomposed leaves to discarded food wrappers. It was exactly the kind of revolting mixture that would appeal to someone looking to create maximum humiliation while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. "You made this mess," Torai said, gesturing toward the muddy pools with theatrical disgust. "So you're going to clean it up the old-fashioned way." Madison's phone camera zoomed in on Emma's face, capturing her expression of growing understanding and horror. "Oh my God, this is going to be so viral," she breathed, her excitement barely contained. Emma Rodriguez, a mysterious art girl, finally gets what she deserves. Emma's training kicked in automatically, her mind cataloging escape routes and tactical options, even as her conscious thoughts recoiled from the implications of what was being suggested. She could run, but the enclosed space limited her options and would require her to display the kind of speed and agility that would raise uncomfortable questions. She could fight, but 3 against 1 would require her to use techniques that would be impossible to explain away later. She could scream for help, but the location had been chosen specifically to minimize the chances of adult intervention. Every option led to exposure of her true identity, and exposure meant the end of everything she had worked to build. The shadow guard would learn that she was alive. Her aunt would discover that her quiet niece was actually a former covert operative, and her carefully constructed normal life would collapse in the most spectacular way possible. She would be back to running and hiding, but this time without the protection of an organization that believed she was dead. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was trapped not by the 3 teenagers surrounding her, but by the very cover identity that had protected her for 2 years. Emma Rodriguez, the shy art student, couldn't fight back without destroying herself in the process. She was going to have to endure whatever they had planned, maintaining her helpless facade while her every instinct screamed at her to end this confrontation with decisive action. "Please," she said, the word coming out as barely a whisper. "I haven't done anything to you. I just want to finish my community service and go home." Torai's smile was radiant and terrible, the expression of someone who had just confirmed their absolute power over another human being. "Oh, you're going to finish your service, all right. You're going to clean up every drop of this contaminated water with your mouth." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and Emma felt her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around her. She had survived assassination attempts, protected targets through active combat zones, and faced down international criminals without flinching. But she had never felt as helpless as she did in that moment, surrounded by 3 privileged teenagers who had the power to destroy her new life with a single viral video. Tyler moved closer, his bulk blocking any potential escape route toward the main campus. "You heard her," he said, his voice carrying the kind of casual menace that suggested he was completely comfortable with what they were demanding. "Get on your knees and start cleaning." Unless you want this to get a lot worse. Madison's commentary continued as she adjusted her phone's angle to capture the perfect shot. I can't believe she's actually going to do it. This is insane. Everyone's going to see this. Emma Rodriguez, the girl who thought she was too good for the rest of us, eating dirt like the freak she really is. Emma's knees gave out, and she found herself sinking toward the concrete without any conscious decision to comply. Her body was responding to the psychological pressure, even as her mind continued to race through impossible scenarios. She could feel the weight of her carefully constructed identity pressing down on her like a physical force, demanding that she maintain the performance, even at the cost of her dignity and self-respect. The muddy water pooled around her knees, soaking through her jeans and filling her nostrils with the scent of decay and contamination. Somewhere in the distance she could hear the normal sounds of campus life continuing, students walking to their cars, teachers locking up classrooms, the everyday bustle of a school day ending. But in this hidden corner behind the gymnasium, she was completely alone with her tormentors and the terrible choice they were forcing her to make. Emma's hands trembled as she leaned forward, her face inches from the contaminated slurry that would soon be in her mouth. Every fiber of her being rebelled against what she was about to do, but the alternative was unthinkable. She had to maintain her cover, had to protect the new life she had built, even if it meant enduring the most humiliating experience of her 17 years. As she lowered her head toward the muddy water, Emma caught sight of her reflection in the dark surface. For just a moment, she saw not the helpless teenager she had been pretending to be, but the trained operative she had once been, someone who would never have allowed herself to be put in this position, who would have ended this confrontation before it began. The contrast was so stark that it took her breath away, forcing her to confront the reality of what she had become in her desperate attempt to live a normal life. But there was no going back now. Too many people were watching, too much was at stake, and too many lives depended on her ability to maintain the lie that had become her entire existence. Emma Rodriguez, the quiet art student, was about to suffer the most public humiliation of her life, and there was absolutely nothing that Nightingale, the former Shadow Guard operative, could do to stop it. Part 3. The Secret Identity Revealed. The taste of contaminated mud filled Emma's mouth as she forced herself to swallow the revolting mixture, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to resist. The slurry contained decomposed leaves, cigarette butts, and unidentifiable debris that had been fermenting in the drainage system for weeks. Her stomach churned violently, but she managed to keep the vile substance down while Madison's phone camera captured every agonizing second for her growing online audience. Tori Matthews stood over her with an expression of pure satisfaction, savoring the moment of absolute dominance over someone she had identified as a threat to her carefully maintained social order. Tyler Brooks laughed with the kind of cruel delight that suggested he had done this sort of thing many times before, while Madison provided breathless commentary that would soon be shared across multiple social media platforms. But as Emma knelt in the mud, enduring the worst humiliation of her carefully constructed normal life, her mind was operating on an entirely different level. The systematic degradation she was experiencing triggered memories that she had spent 2 years trying to suppress. Recollections of a life that had prepared her for situations far more dangerous than anything these privileged teenagers could imagine. Emma Rodriguez might have been helpless in this moment, but she had not always been Emma Rodriguez. 3 years ago, she had been known by a different name in circles that operated far from the safety of suburban high schools. As Nightingale, she had been the youngest member ever inducted into the Shadow Guard, an elite protection agency that specialized in safeguarding high-value targets in the world's most dangerous situations. The Shadow Guard had been founded in the aftermath of the Cold War by a consortium of intelligence agencies who recognized the need for a protection service that could operate outside traditional governmental structures. Their clients included diplomats, corporate executives, political dissidents, and anyone else whose work made them targets for kidnapping, assassination, or other forms of violence. What made the Shadow Guard unique was their philosophy of invisible protection. Their operatives were trained to blend seamlessly into any environment, while maintaining constant vigilance against potential threats. Recruitment for the Shadow Guard followed patterns that would have been considered unconventional by traditional intelligence services. They sought candidates who combined exceptional physical and intellectual abilities with personal circumstances. That made them unlikely to be missed if they disappeared into the covert world. Orphans, runaways, and young people who had been failed by conventional support systems were particularly attractive recruits, as they possessed both the motivation to excel and the flexibility to adapt to demanding lifestyles. Emma had been 13 years old when Shadow Guard recruiters first approached her, 6 months after her parents had been killed in a terrorist attack on a United Nations facility in Somalia. Michael and Carmen Rodriguez had been career diplomats who specialized in conflict resolution, working in some of the world's most dangerous regions to negotiate peace agreements and humanitarian aid distributions. Their deaths had left Emma orphaned and traumatized, with no immediate family members willing or able to take responsibility for her care. The official story was that Emma had been placed in a series of foster homes, but the reality was far more complex. Shadow Guard operatives had been monitoring the Rodriguez family for months before the attack, recognizing their daughter's exceptional potential and the likelihood that their dangerous work would eventually leave her without protection. The terrorist attack that killed her parents had been anticipated, though the specific timing and location had been impossible to predict. In the aftermath of the tragedy, Shadow Guard representatives had approached Emma with an offer that seemed almost too good to be true. They would provide her with a home, education, and purpose, but in exchange, she would dedicate herself to preventing other families from experiencing the kind of loss that had destroyed her world. The philosophical appeal was irresistible to a traumatized teenager desperate for meaning, and Emma had accepted their proposal without fully understanding what it would entail. Shadow Guard training was unlike anything that existed in conventional military or intelligence organizations. Their operatives needed to be capable of functioning effectively in any environment, from diplomatic receptions to active combat zones, often with minimal support and no backup. The physical conditioning was brutal, designed to push small frames to their absolute limits, while building the kind of functional strength that would allow them to protect much larger principles. Emma's days had begun before dawn with cardiovascular training that would have challenged professional athletes. Running, swimming, and cycling were combined with obstacle courses that tested agility, balance, and problem-solving under pressure. The goal was not to build obvious muscle mass, which would have been counterproductive for operatives who needed to maintain unassuming appearances, but to develop the kind of functional fitness that would allow them to perform at peak levels for extended periods. Combat training covered an eclectic mix of martial arts, selected for their effectiveness in close-quarters protection scenarios. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu taught Emma how to use leverage and technique to overcome opponents twice her size, while Krav Maga training focused on the kind of ruthless efficiency needed to neutralize threats before they could escalate. Boxing and Muay Thai provided striking skills, while specialized weapons training covered everything from traditional firearms to improvised implements. But the Shadow Guard's training philosophy extended far beyond physical preparation. Their operatives were educated in psychology, sociology, and anthropology to better understand the motivations and behaviors of both their principals and potential threats. Language instruction was mandatory, with most operatives achieving conversational fluency in at least 4 languages. Technology training covered surveillance equipment, communication systems, and digital security protocols that would allow them to operate effectively in an increasingly connected world. Emma had discovered that she possessed natural talents that made her exceptionally well suited for Shadow Guard work. Her small stature and youthful appearance allowed her to blend into environments where more obvious security personnel would have been conspicuous. Her artistic abilities, which had been encouraged by her diplomat parents, proved useful for creating cover identities and maintaining surveillance without attracting attention. Most importantly, Emma had demonstrated an intuitive understanding of human behavior that allowed her to identify potential threats before they materialized. She could read micro-expressions and body language with uncanny accuracy, often sensing danger minutes before it became apparent to more experienced operatives. Her handlers had compared her favorably to agents with decades of field experience, noting her ability to balance hypervigilance with the kind of relaxed confidence that made her principals feel safe. For 3 years, Emma had thrown herself into shadow guard training with the dedication of someone who had found her true calling. The organization had become her family, providing the sense of belonging and purpose that had been stripped away by her parents' deaths. She had believed that she was exactly where she belonged, that her tragic childhood had been transformed into something meaningful and important. Her specialty had become close-quarters protection for high-risk diplomatic families, particularly situations involving children and teenagers who needed to maintain some semblance of normal life, despite constant danger. Emma's youthful appearance and natural artistic abilities made her perfect for assignments where she could pose as a fellow student or young family friend, providing protection that was both highly effective and completely invisible to outside observers. The irony was not lost on her that she was now experiencing the very kind of situation she had once been trained to prevent. Bullying, intimidation, and psychological warfare had been standard threats in her protection portfolio, and she had developed dozens of techniques for neutralizing such situations before they could escalate to physical violence. But all of those skills had been designed for protecting other people, not for maintaining deep cover as a potential victim. As Emma knelt in the mud behind Riverside Valley High School, enduring the worst humiliation of her carefully constructed normal life, she found herself remembering specific training scenarios that had prepared her for exactly this kind of psychological pressure. Shadow Guard instructors had subjected their students to various forms of degradation and humiliation, not out of cruelty, but to ensure that they could maintain their composure and continue functioning effectively even when their dignity was under assault. The memories were vivid and painful, but they also provided a strange kind of comfort. Emma had survived far worse than this during her training, had endured systematic attempts to break her will and compromise her judgment. The techniques that Tori, Tyler, and Madison were using against her were crude and obvious compared to the sophisticated psychological warfare that had been part of her daily routine for 3 years. But there was a crucial difference between those training scenarios and her current situation. During Shadow Guard exercises, Emma had always known that the degradation was temporary and purposeful, designed to build her resilience and prepare her for real-world threats. The instructors who had subjected her to various forms of humiliation had been professionals who respected her abilities and were working to help her develop into a more effective operative. This was different. The 3 teenagers surrounding her were not trying to make her stronger or more capable. They were attempting to destroy her sense of self-worth for their own entertainment and social advancement. The cruelty was genuine, not performative, and the consequences would extend far beyond any training exercise. Emma could feel her carefully constructed identity beginning to crack under the pressure of the psychological assault. The quiet, artistic persona she had maintained for 2 years was being systematically demolished by people who had no idea what they were unleashing. Every second of forced compliance was eroding the barrier she had built between her current life and her previous existence as a Shadow Guard operative. The most dangerous part was that maintaining her cover was becoming physically painful in ways that transcended mere humiliation. Her body was accustomed to responding to threats with immediate and decisive action, and the effort required to suppress those responses was creating the kind of psychological strain that she had never experienced during her training. The cognitive dissonance between her capabilities and her performance was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Emma's hands trembled as she wiped mud from her mouth, trying to ignore the taste and texture of the contaminated slurry she had been forced to consume. Madison's phone camera continued recording, capturing every detail of her degradation for an audience that would grow exponentially as the video was shared across social media platforms. The humiliation was becoming a permanent part of her digital identity, something that would follow her for years, regardless of what happened next. But as she knelt there in the mud, Emma made a decision that would change everything. She was done being a victim, done pretending to be helpless, done allowing her cover identity to be more important than her fundamental sense of self-worth. The shadow guard had trained her to be the kind of person who protected others from exactly this kind of cruelty, and she was going to honor that training regardless of the consequences. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. Emma Rodriguez, the quiet art student, was about to disappear forever. In her place would stand someone who had been forged in the crucible of elite training, someone who possessed skills and experience that would terrify anyone who understood their true implications. The carefully constructed normal life she had built over 2 years was about to be sacrificed in the most dramatic way possible. But first, she would give them one last chance to walk away. Not because she was afraid of them, but because she was afraid of what she might do if they forced her to abandon the restraint that had kept her true nature hidden for so long. The shadow guard had taught her that the most effective protection often came from preventing violence rather than responding to it, and she owed it to her training to attempt de-escalation before resorting to more direct measures. Emma looked up at Tori Matthews, her eyes no longer carrying the helpless vulnerability that had characterized her performance for 2 years. Instead, they held the kind of calm assessment that suggested she was evaluating threats and considering responses with professional detachment. The change was subtle but unmistakable, and she could see Tori's confident expression falter slightly as she registered the shift. "You've had your fun," Emma said quietly, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to come from nowhere. "Walk away now, and we can pretend this never happened." Tyler laughed, but the sound was forced and uncertain. "Listen to her," he said, though his voice lacked the casual menace that had characterized his earlier comments. "Acting like she's in charge all of a sudden. I think eating dirt made her delusional." Madison's phone camera captured the exchange, but her commentary had become less confident as she sensed the changing dynamic. "This is so weird," she said, her voice carrying a note of confusion that suggested she was beginning to realize that something fundamental had shifted in the situation. Emma stood slowly, her movements controlled and deliberate as she assessed the tactical situation with the kind of professional detachment that had once kept diplomats alive in war zones. 3. Opponents, poorly trained and overconfident, positioned in a way that suggested they had no understanding of basic tactical principles. The confined space behind the gymnasium that had seemed like a trap now appeared to be exactly the kind of controlled environment where superior skills could be applied with maximum effectiveness. But she would give them one more opportunity to avoid the confrontation that was becoming increasingly inevitable. Emma Rodriguez might have been willing to endure humiliation to maintain her cover, but Nightingale had never walked away from a fight when innocent people were being threatened. And she was beginning to realize that allowing this behavior to continue would inevitably result in other victims suffering the same fate. The decision crystallized in her mind with the kind of clarity that had once characterized her most successful missions. She was done hiding, done pretending to be helpless, done allowing her cover identity to be more important than doing what was right. The shadow guard had trained her to be a protector, and it was time to remember who she really was. Part 4. The breaking point. Emma's warning hung in the air between them like a line drawn in the sand, creating a moment of tension that seemed to stretch far beyond its actual duration. Tori Matthews stood frozen, her predatory confidence suddenly replaced by a flicker of uncertainty as she processed the dramatic change in her victim's demeanor. Tyler Brooks shifted his weight uncertainly, his bulk no longer seeming quite as intimidating as it had moments before. Madison Clark continued recording, but her breathless commentary had been replaced by confused silence as she struggled to understand what was happening. The transformation in Emma was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew how to read the signs. Her posture had shifted from the hunched, defensive stance of a victim to the balanced readiness of someone prepared for action. Her eyes, which had been downcast and frightened throughout the confrontation, now held a steady assessment that suggested she was cataloging threats and calculating responses with professional detachment. But most tellingly, the tremor in her hands had disappeared entirely. The nervous energy that had characterized her performance as a helpless victim had been replaced by the kind of controlled stillness that suggested coiled potential waiting to be unleashed. Emma Rodriguez, the quiet art student, was fading away like a discarded costume, revealing something far more dangerous underneath. Tori was the first to recognize that the dynamic had fundamentally changed, her predatory instincts alerting her to the fact that her carefully chosen victim was no longer behaving according to script. The girl kneeling in the mud had been vulnerable and afraid, perfect material for the kind of systematic humiliation that had made Tori the undisputed queen of Riverside Valley's social hierarchy. But the person now standing before her radiated a quiet authority that suggested she was accustomed to being in control of dangerous situations. "What did you just say to me?" Tori asked, her voice carrying an edge of hysteria that betrayed how completely the situation had shifted beyond her expectations. The careful manipulation and psychological warfare that had always been her preferred weapons seemed suddenly inadequate against someone who was no longer responding to intimidation with the expected fear and submission. Emma's response was measured and calm, delivered with the kind of professional detachment that suggested she had given similar warnings countless times before. "I said walk away. This doesn't have to go any further than it already has. You've gotten your video, you've had your fun. Now it's time to leave." Tyler stepped forward, his basketball player's build making him appear even larger in the confined space behind the gymnasium. But his movement lacked the casual menace that had characterized his earlier intimidation tactics. Instead, he moved with the uncertain aggression of someone who was beginning to realize that they might have misjudged their target, but was too committed to the confrontation to back down gracefully. "You think you're tough all of a sudden?" he demanded, his voice carrying a note of desperation that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. "You're still the same pathetic freak who just ate dirt because we told you to. Nothing's changed." But everything had changed, and Emma could see that all three of her tormentors were beginning to understand that fact on some level. The problem was that their social dynamics and public personas were now invested in this confrontation in ways that made retreat difficult. Tori's reputation as the school's dominant predator, Tyler's image as an intimidating enforcer, and Madison's brand as a creator of viral content had all become dependent on maintaining the narrative they had established. Emma found herself remembering specific shadow guard training scenarios that had prepared her for exactly this kind of escalation. Her instructors had taught her that the most dangerous moments in any confrontation often came when opponents realized they were overmatched but felt unable to withdraw without losing face. Pride and public image could drive people to continue fighting long past the point where rational self-interest would have suggested surrender. The solution, according to Shadow Guard doctrine, was to provide opponents with a face-saving exit strategy that allowed them to withdraw without appearing weak or defeated. Emma had successfully applied this principle dozens of times during her training, de-escalating potentially violent situations through a combination of demonstrated capability and strategic empathy for her opponent's psychological needs. But the current situation was complicated by factors that hadn't been present in her training scenarios. Madison's phone camera was broadcasting the confrontation to an audience that would grow exponentially as the video was shared across social media platforms. Any resolution that didn't provide satisfying content for her followers would be seen as a failure, creating pressure to escalate rather than de-escalate the situation. Moreover, the three teenagers surrounding Emma had built their entire social identities around their ability to dominate and humiliate others with impunity. Walking away from this confrontation would represent a fundamental challenge to their self-image and their position in Riverside Valley's social hierarchy. The stakes had become much higher than simple teenage bullying. They were now fighting for their entire worldview. Emma realized with growing certainty that peaceful resolution was becoming increasingly unlikely. Her opponents were trapped by their own psychological needs and social dynamics in ways that made retreat nearly impossible. The confrontation was going to escalate, and she was going to have to choose between maintaining her cover and protecting herself from further assault. The decision was made for her when Tyler moved closer, his hands balling into fists as he prepared to use physical force to re-establish the power dynamic that had been slipping away since Emma's warning. His movement was clumsy and telegraphed, the kind of obvious aggression that would have been easily countered by anyone with even basic training in personal protection. "I think you need to remember your place," Tyler said, his voice carrying the kind of menace that suggested he was preparing to escalate to physical violence. "Maybe eating dirt wasn't enough. Maybe you need something that'll really teach you some respect." Emma's training kicked in automatically, her perception seeming to slow as she processed Tyler's approach with the kind of tactical analysis that had once kept diplomatic principles safe in active combat zones. His stance was all wrong, weight distribution favoring his right side in a way that suggested he was preparing to throw a haymaker punch. His hands were too high, leaving his midsection exposed, and his feet were positioned in a way that would make it difficult for him to recover if his initial attack failed. Most importantly, Tyler was moving with the kind of overconfident aggression that characterized untrained fighters who had never faced serious opposition. His size and strength had probably been sufficient to intimidate most opponents in the past, but he had no understanding of how to use those advantages effectively against someone who knew what they were doing. Emma could have ended the confrontation in seconds, using any of dozens of techniques she had mastered during her shadow guard training. A precise strike to Tyler's solar plexus would have dropped him without causing permanent damage, while a properly applied joint lock could have controlled him completely without requiring significant force. But either response would have revealed capabilities that would be impossible to explain away later. Instead, Emma chose to demonstrate just enough skill to discourage further aggression while maintaining plausible deniability about her true abilities. As Tyler's clumsy punch approached, she moved with the kind of fluid grace that suggested natural athleticism rather than professional training, sidestepping his attack and allowing his momentum to carry him past her position. The movement was perfectly timed and executed, but Emma was careful to make it appear accidental rather than deliberate. She stumbled slightly as she avoided Tyler's punch, adding a note of clumsiness that would support the narrative that she had simply gotten lucky rather than demonstrating superior technique. Tyler's momentum carried him stumbling past Emma's position, his overcommitted punch leaving him completely off balance as he crashed into a stack of empty recycling bins that clattered loudly across the concrete. The sound echoed through the confined space behind the gymnasium, creating enough noise that Emma worried it might attract unwanted attention from campus security or late-staying teachers. But the real problem wasn't the noise. It was the expression on Tyler's face as he picked himself up from the ground, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment and rage at having been made to look foolish in front of his girlfriend and her camera. Emma recognized that look from her shadow guard training, It was the moment when rational thought gave way to pure aggression. When someone decided that inflicting damage was more important than achieving any strategic objective. Madison's phone camera had captured every second of Tyler's stumbling failure, and Emma could see her eyes lighting up with the kind of excitement that suggested she was already imagining the viral potential of the footage. "Oh my God, did you see that?" Madison squealed, her voice carrying across the empty space behind the gymnasium. "Tyler just got completely owned by the art freak. This is incredible content." Torai's face had gone pale as she realized that the carefully orchestrated humiliation she had planned was spiraling completely out of control. Her social media savvy was advanced enough to understand that any video of Tyler being embarrassed by Emma would undermine her entire power structure at Riverside Valley High School. The narrative that was supposed to establish her absolute dominance had become something that could destroy her reputation instead. "Turn off the camera," Torai hissed at Madison, her voice carrying an edge of desperation that Emma had never heard before. "This isn't what we planned. We need to reset this whole situation." But Madison was too intoxicated by the potential viral success of her footage to listen to strategic considerations. Her 15,000 TikTok followers were already engaging with the livestream, sending hearts and comments that were feeding her addiction to online attention. The possibility of going truly viral, of creating content that would be shared across multiple platforms and generate millions of views, was too tempting to abandon. "Are you crazy?" Madison shot back, never taking her eyes off her phone screen. "This is gold. We're going to be famous." Emma Rodriguez just became the girl who took down Tyler Brooks, and I got it all on video. Emma realized with growing alarm that the situation was deteriorating in ways that her shadow guard training hadn't fully prepared her for. The dynamics of social media and viral content creation were adding layers of complexity that made traditional de-escalation techniques less effective. Madison's desire for online fame was creating pressure to escalate rather than resolve the confrontation, while Torai's desperation to maintain her social status was making her increasingly unpredictable. Tyler pushed himself to his feet, his face twisted with humiliation and rage as he prepared for another attack. But this time his approach was different, more calculated and dangerous. The embarrassment of his failed punch had stripped away his overconfident swagger, revealing the kind of focused aggression that suggested he was now taking Emma seriously as a threat. "You think you're smart?" Tyler snarled, his voice carrying a menace that was far more concerning than his earlier casual intimidation. "You think making me look stupid is going to save you? I'm going to make you pay for that." Emma's tactical assessment shifted as she recognized the change in Tyler's demeanor. He was no longer the clumsy, overconfident bully who had telegraphed his first attack. The humiliation had transformed him into something more dangerous, someone who was willing to use serious violence to restore his damaged ego. The confined space behind the gymnasium, which had seemed manageable when dealing with amateur intimidation tactics, now felt genuinely threatening. The problem was that Emma's options remained severely limited by the need to maintain her cover identity. Demonstrating the kind of advanced combat skills that would be necessary to neutralize Tyler's enhanced aggression would raise questions that she couldn't answer without destroying the carefully constructed life she had built over the past 2 years, but failing to respond effectively could result in serious injury or worse. Emma found herself caught between two impossible choices: reveal her true capabilities and face the consequences of exposure, or maintain her facade and risk being seriously hurt by someone who was no longer concerned with keeping the violence within acceptable limits. The Shadow Guard had trained her for many complex scenarios, but they had never addressed the psychological burden of being forced to choose between mission security and personal safety. Tyler's second approach was methodical and dangerous, his basketball training evident in the way he used his size and reach to control space and limit Emma's movement options. He had learned from his first mistake, keeping his guard up and his feet properly positioned as he closed the distance between them. This wasn't the wild swing of an inexperienced fighter. It was the calculated aggression of someone who had decided that serious violence was an acceptable solution to his problems. Emma backed toward the gymnasium wall, her movement appearing defensive and frightened while actually positioning herself to use the concrete surface as a tactical advantage if the situation required more advanced techniques. Her shadow guard training had covered dozens of ways to use environmental features in combat, but implementing any of them would require her to abandon the pretense that she was just a lucky amateur who had stumbled out of the way of Tyler's first attack. The wall pressed against her back, eliminating her retreat options and forcing her to confront the reality that she was going to have to make a choice. Tyler's approach was steady and menacing, his eyes locked on her with the kind of predatory focus that suggested he was planning to inflict serious damage. Behind him, Tori watched with growing anxiety as she realized that her carefully planned humiliation was transforming into something far more dangerous than she had intended. Madison continued recording, her commentary providing a running narrative that would become part of the permanent record of whatever was about to happen. "This is so intense," she breathed, her voice trembling with excitement and fear. "Tyler looks like he's really going to hurt her. I can't believe this is actually happening." Emma's mind raced through the tactical options available to her, each one evaluated against the potential consequences for her cover identity. She could continue playing the role of helpless victim, hoping that Tyler would eventually be satisfied with a beating that stopped short of permanent damage. She could attempt to escape, though the confined space and Tyler's superior size made that unlikely to succeed. Or she could fight back with enough skill to end the confrontation decisively, accepting that doing so would destroy the carefully constructed normal life she had worked so hard to build. The decision was made for her when Tyler lunged forward. With genuine killing intent, his hands reaching for her throat with the kind of focused aggression that suggested he was no longer concerned with maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. The attack was fast and coordinated, demonstrating that he possessed more athletic ability than his earlier clumsiness had suggested. Emma's training kicked in automatically, her body responding to the threat with techniques that had been drilled into her through thousands of hours of practice. Time seemed to slow as her enhanced perception processed Tyler's approach, identifying vulnerabilities in his attack and calculating the most efficient response. But even as her reflexes prepared to neutralize the threat, her conscious mind recoiled from the implications of what she was about to reveal. The internal conflict lasted only milliseconds, but it felt like an eternity as Emma confronted the fundamental question that had been haunting her for 2 years. Was maintaining her cover identity worth risking her life? The Shadow Guard had trained her to prioritize mission objectives above personal safety, but they had also taught her that no mission was worth dying for if there were alternatives available. Tyler's hands closed around her throat, his grip tightening with enough force to cut off her air supply and make her vision start to blur around the edges. The attack was no longer the casual violence of a school bully. It was attempted murder disguised as teenage conflict. Emma realized with crystal clarity that she was facing a choice between revealing her true identity and potentially dying to protect a cover story that was no longer worth preserving. The transformation was instantaneous and devastating. Emma's right hand moved with surgical precision, striking Tyler's elbow joint at exactly the angle needed to hyperextend the ligaments and force him to release his grip. The technique was performed with the kind of clinical efficiency that suggested extensive training in anatomy and combat medicine, targeting nerve clusters and pressure points that most people wouldn't even know existed. Tyler's scream of pain echoed through the confined space as Emma's strike disabled his arm, but she wasn't finished. Her left hand moved in a blur of motion, applying pressure to specific points on his neck that caused his legs to buckle and his vision to blur. The technique was designed to incapacitate without causing permanent damage, but it required knowledge of human physiology that would be impossible for a normal teenager to possess. Tyler collapsed to his knees, gasping for air as Emma's precisely applied pressure caused temporary paralysis in his limbs. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds, but it had revealed capabilities that shattered any pretense that Emma Rodriguez was just a lucky amateur who had stumbled into an effective defense. Madison's phone camera had captured every detail of Emma's devastating counterattack, recording evidence that would make it impossible to maintain the fiction that she was anything other than a highly trained operative. Her TikTok followers were exploding with comments and reactions, their excitement at witnessing genuine violence mixing with confusion about how the quiet art girl had suddenly transformed into someone capable of disabling a much larger opponent with surgical precision. Tori Matthews stood frozen in shock, her carefully constructed worldview crumbling, as she watched someone she had identified as the perfect victim systematically dismantling the social order she had worked so hard to maintain. The girl who had been kneeling in the mud just minutes earlier was now standing over Tyler's incapacitated form with the kind of calm competence that suggested this was routine rather than exceptional. Emma looked down at Tyler's gasping form, her expression carrying none of the satisfaction or excitement that might have been expected from someone who had just defended herself against a serious attack. Instead, her face showed the kind of professional assessment that suggested she was evaluating whether additional measures would be necessary to ensure the threat was completely neutralized. "I warned you," Emma said quietly, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to fill the entire space behind the gymnasium. "I gave you every opportunity to walk away. But you chose to escalate this into something dangerous, and now you have to live with the consequences." Madison's commentary had devolved into breathless exclamations of disbelief as she struggled to process what she had just witnessed and recorded. "I can't believe what just happened," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of Tyler's labored breathing. "Emma just destroyed him. Like, completely destroyed him. How did she even know how to do that?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Emma realized that there was no possible explanation for her capabilities that wouldn't reveal at least part of her true identity. A normal teenager might have gotten lucky once, might have landed a fortunate blow that temporarily disabled an attacker. But the systematic efficiency with which she had neutralized Tyler's assault demonstrated training and experience that couldn't be explained away as beginner's luck. Emma's carefully constructed normal life was disintegrating in real time, broadcast live to Madison's growing audience as they watched the quiet art student reveal herself to be something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The secret she had protected for 2 years was now recorded in high-definition video that would soon be shared across multiple social media platforms, making it impossible to maintain any pretense about her true nature. But as Emma looked at Tyler's incapacitated form and saw the genuine fear in Torre's eyes, she realized that she felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years: relief. The constant strain of suppressing her true capabilities, of pretending to be helpless when she possessed skills that could neutralize any threat, had been eating away at her psychological well-being in ways she hadn't fully recognized. For the first time since arriving at Riverside Valley High School, Emma Rodriguez was being completely honest about who she was. The revelation was terrifying and liberating in equal measure, forcing her to confront the reality that her experiment in normal teenage life had been doomed from the beginning. She couldn't maintain the pretense indefinitely, not when doing so required her to deny fundamental aspects of her identity and training. Tori found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What are you?" she asked, her usual confidence replaced by the kind of genuine fear that Emma had hoped never to inspire in her classmates. "That's not Normal people don't fight like that. How did you learn to do that? Emma looked at Tori with the kind of calm assessment that suggested she was evaluating whether the girl represented a continued threat or simply a bystander who had gotten in over her head. The predatory confidence that had made Tori the queen of Riverside Valley's social hierarchy had evaporated completely, replaced by the wide-eyed terror of someone who had suddenly realized they were dealing with forces far beyond their understanding. "I'm exactly who I've always been," Emma said, her voice carrying a note of sadness that suggested she was mourning the loss of her carefully constructed identity. "You just never bothered to look carefully enough to see it." The truth was more complex than that simple statement suggested, but Emma wasn't prepared to reveal the full extent of her background to 3 teenagers who had already demonstrated poor judgment about keeping sensitive information private. Madison's phone camera was still recording, and anything Emma said would become part of the permanent digital record that would follow her for the rest of her life. Tyler was beginning to recover from the effects of Emma's pressure point strikes, his limbs regaining sensation as the temporary paralysis wore off. But his earlier aggression had been completely replaced by the kind of cautious fear that suggested he now understood exactly how outmatched he had been from the beginning. He pushed himself to his feet slowly, keeping his hands visible and his movements non-threatening as he backed away from Emma's position. "I'm sorry," Tyler said, his voice carrying genuine remorse mixed with fear. "I didn't know. I never would have. If I had realized what you were capable of, I never would have touched you." Emma's expression softened slightly at Tyler's apology, recognizing the genuine fear and regret in his voice. The Shadow Guard had taught her that the most effective resolution to any conflict was one that left all parties with their dignity intact and no desire for revenge. Tyler's willingness to acknowledge his mistake and back down suggested that he could potentially be trusted not to escalate the situation further. "The important thing is that you understand now," Emma said, her tone becoming less threatening as she recognized Tyler's genuine submission. "I don't want to hurt anyone, but I won't let myself be victimized either. We can all walk away from this and pretend it never happened, or we can let it escalate further. The choice is yours." Madison was still recording, her phone camera capturing every word of the exchange as her followers continued to flood the livestream with comments and reactions. The viral potential of the footage was enormous, and Emma realized that even if the 3 teenagers agreed to keep quiet about what had happened, the video evidence would make it impossible to maintain her cover identity for much longer. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the direction of the main campus, suggesting that the noise of the confrontation had finally attracted adult attention. Emma's enhanced hearing identified at least 2 people moving toward their position, probably campus security or teachers conducting end-of-day building checks. The arrival of authority figures would complicate the situation exponentially, forcing Emma to explain her capabilities to adults who would be much more likely to ask difficult questions. "Someone's coming," Emma said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of tactical awareness that suggested she was already planning for the next phase of the situation. "We need to decide right now how we're going to handle this. We can tell them that Tyler slipped and fell while we were cleaning up, or we can tell them the truth and deal with all the questions that will follow." Tori's eyes darted between Emma's calm face and Tyler's obviously shaken demeanor, her strategic mind working to identify the option that would best protect her social status and future prospects. The idea of explaining to school administrators that she had orchestrated the systematic humiliation of a fellow student was almost as terrifying as dealing with Emma's revealed capabilities. "We say he slipped," Tori said quickly, her voice carrying the kind of desperate certainty that suggested she was willing to agree to almost anything that would prevent adult intervention. "Nobody needs to know what really happened here. We all just keep our mouths shut and move on with our lives." Madison looked uncertain, her phone still recording as she struggled to balance her desire for viral content against the obvious risks. of revealing what had actually occurred. The footage she had captured could make her internet famous, but it could also result in serious consequences for everyone involved if it came to the attention of school authorities or law enforcement. Emma recognized the conflict in Madison's expression and realized that she needed to provide additional motivation for the girl to keep the footage private. The shadow guard had taught her that the most effective way to ensure silence was to make it clear that breaking that silence would result in consequences far worse than whatever benefits might be gained. "Madison," Emma said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that suggested she was accustomed to being obeyed without question. "That video contains evidence of a serious assault that could result in criminal charges for everyone involved. If it gets shared or uploaded anywhere, you'll be an accessory to whatever legal consequences follow. Is your internet fame really worth potentially going to jail?" The question hit Madison like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the reality that her desire for viral content could have consequences far beyond social media metrics. Her followers were still flooding the livestream with comments, but their excitement suddenly seemed less appealing when weighed against the possibility of criminal prosecution. "I'll delete it," Madison said quickly, her fingers moving to end the livestream and remove the recorded footage from her phone. "Everything gets deleted right now. Nobody ever needs to see this." Emma nodded approvingly, recognizing that Madison's fear of legal consequences was probably sufficient to ensure her cooperation, at least in the short term. But she also understood that the situation remained fundamentally unstable, with too many people knowing too much about her capabilities for her cover identity to remain viable for much longer. The approaching footsteps were getting closer, and Emma could hear voices suggesting that multiple adults were investigating the disturbance. She had perhaps 30 seconds to ensure that everyone's story was consistent before they would be forced to explain the situation to people who would be much more difficult to manipulate or intimidate. "Tyler slipped while we were cleaning and hit his head," Emma said, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that suggested this was a statement of fact rather than a suggestion. "Madison was recording a video about community service when it happened. Torai and I helped him get back on his feet. That's all anyone needs to know." The story was simple and plausible, providing a reasonable explanation for Tyler's obvious distress without raising questions about Emma's capabilities or the true nature of the confrontation. It also positioned all 4 teenagers as cooperative witnesses to an accident rather than participants in a violent altercation, making it less likely that adults would investigate further. Tyler nodded his agreement, still obviously shaken by his encounter with Emma's true capabilities but clearly grateful for the opportunity to avoid explaining how he had been systematically dismantled by someone half his size. Torai's relief was palpable as she realized that Emma was offering her a way to escape the situation without destroying her carefully constructed social status. The adults rounded the corner just as the 4 teenagers arranged themselves in positions that supported their agreed-upon story. Emma knelt beside Tyler with the kind of concerned expression that suggested she was trying to help an injured classmate, while Torai stood nearby looking appropriately worried. Madison had switched her phone to camera mode, creating the appearance that she had been documenting community service rather than recording a violent confrontation. "Is everything all right back here?" called Mr. Peterson, the art teacher who had allowed Emma to use the abandoned classroom for her lunch periods. His expression showed genuine concern rather than suspicion, suggesting that he viewed the situation as a potential accident rather than evidence of student conflict. "Tyler slipped while we were cleaning out the drainage system," Emma replied, her voice carrying exactly the right note of helpful concern. "He hit his head pretty hard, but I think he's going to be okay. We were just making sure he was steady on his feet before helping him get to the nurse's office." Mr. Peterson approached with the kind of cautious concern that suggested he was experienced in dealing with student injuries, his eyes scanning the scene for any signs that the situation was more serious than Emma's explanation suggested. Tyler's obvious distress and the muddy conditions around the drainage system supported the story perfectly, making it seem like a straightforward accident rather than the aftermath of a violent confrontation. Emma realized with a mixture of relief and sadness that she had successfully navigated the immediate crisis, but at the cost of revealing capabilities that made it impossible to continue pretending to be a normal teenager. The carefully constructed identity that had protected her for 2 years was now compromised beyond repair, forcing her to confront the reality that her experiment in normal life was coming to an end. The question was no longer whether her cover would be blown, but when and how completely. Madison might have deleted the livestream footage, but dozens of her followers had probably recorded their own copies during the broadcast. Tori and Tyler would keep quiet in the short term, but the knowledge of Emma's true capabilities would eventually find its way into the broader student population through gossip and speculation. Most importantly, Emma herself was no longer capable of maintaining the psychological pretense that had sustained her performance for 2 years. The relief she felt at finally being able to defend herself effectively was too powerful to suppress, making it impossible to return to the helpless vulnerability that had been her most effective camouflage. As she helped Tyler to his feet and began walking with the group toward the main campus, Emma found herself planning for a future that no longer included Emma Rodriguez, the quiet art student of Riverside Valley High School. That identity had served its purpose, but it was time to move on to whatever came next in a life that had never been designed for normalcy. The following weeks passed in a surreal haze of forced normalcy that felt more like an elaborate performance than actual life. Emma continued attending classes, completing assignments, and maintaining the routine that had defined her existence at Riverside Valley High School for 2 years. But everything had fundamentally changed in ways that became more apparent with each passing day. The agreement to keep silent about what had happened behind the gymnasium held, but barely. Tyler Brooks had returned to school after a day of illness, his arm in a sling that he claimed resulted from a basketball injury. His demeanor around Emma had transformed completely, shifting from casual dismissal to the kind of wary respect typically reserved for dangerous animals. He no longer made eye contact when they passed in the hallways, and Emma noticed that he went out of his way to avoid being alone in the same space as her. Tori Matthews had retreated into a kind of strategic hibernation, her usual predatory confidence replaced by careful observation and calculated distance. The queen bee of Riverside Valley's social hierarchy seemed to be reassessing every interaction and relationship in light of what she had learned about Emma's true capabilities. Her reign of psychological terror had been built on the assumption that she was the apex predator in her environment, and discovering that assumption was false had shaken her to her core. Madison Clark had deleted the livestream footage as promised, but the experience had left her with a nervous energy that manifested in compulsive social media activity. She posted constantly about unrelated topics, as if trying to bury any trace of what had happened under an avalanche of mundane content. Emma suspected that Madison was struggling with the knowledge that she possessed the most explosive content of her social media career, but couldn't share it without facing serious consequences. The most difficult aspect of the aftermath was Emma's own psychological state. For 2 years, she had carefully suppressed every instinct and capability that defined her true identity, forcing herself to play the role of helpless victim whenever confronted with aggression or intimidation. The relief of finally being able to defend herself effectively was intoxicating, but it came with the devastating realization that she could never return to the safety of invisibility. Emma found herself unconsciously displaying confidence and awareness that didn't fit with her established persona. Her posture had straightened, her movements had become more purposeful, and her eyes now tracked potential threats with the kind of professional assessment that would be impossible to explain as normal teenage behavior. The psychological barriers that had allowed her to play the role of vulnerable art student had been shattered beyond repair. The change was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew how to read the signs. Emma caught teachers looking at her with newfound curiosity, as if trying to reconcile the quiet girl they thought they knew with the person who now radiated quiet authority. Her Aunt Sarah had commented that she seemed different lately, more confident and self-assured, though she couldn't identify exactly what had changed. Most concerning was the attention Emma began receiving from students who had never acknowledged her existence before. Word had somehow spread through the school's gossip network that something significant had happened involving her, Tyler, Torai, and Madison. The details remained vague, but the shift in social dynamics was unmistakable. Students who had previously looked through her as if she were invisible now watched her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Emma realized that her carefully constructed anonymity had been compromised beyond recovery. The incident behind the gymnasium had created ripples that were spreading through the social ecosystem of Riverside Valley High School in ways that made it impossible to return to her previous status as a harmless nonentity. She was now someone worth watching, someone with a story that people wanted to understand. The psychological strain of maintaining her cover identity while dealing with the aftermath of exposure was becoming unbearable. Emma found herself lying awake at night, analyzing every interaction and conversation for signs that her true background was being discovered. The paranoia was exhausting, but it was also justified. Too many people knew too much about her capabilities for the secret to remain contained indefinitely. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Emma's worst fears were confirmed when she noticed surveillance that wasn't connected to teenage gossip or social media curiosity. The watcher was a middle-aged man in unremarkable clothing who appeared at random locations around the school campus, always maintaining appropriate distance but clearly conducting systematic observation. His positioning and behavior patterns screamed professional intelligence gathering, and Emma recognized the signs with the kind of cold certainty that made her stomach clench with dread. The shadow guard had found her. Emma's training kicked in automatically as she confirmed the surveillance, her enhanced awareness cataloging every detail of the operative's appearance, equipment, and methodology. He was good, but not good enough to remain invisible to someone who had been trained to detect exactly this kind of observation. His presence meant that her carefully staged death 3 years earlier had been discovered or questioned, leading to a systematic search that had finally traced her to Millbrook, Oregon. The realization brought with it a flood of memories and emotions that Emma had spent 2 years trying to suppress. The shadow guard didn't simply monitor former operatives who had gone rogue. They reclaimed them or eliminated them, depending on the perceived security risk. Emma's knowledge of operational methods, personnel, and ongoing missions made her a potential threat that couldn't be allowed to exist outside their control. The operative's presence also meant that Agent Marcus Sullivan, her former handler and the closest thing to a father figure she had known since her parents' deaths, was probably aware of her survival. The guilt and betrayal Emma felt at the thought of facing him again was almost overwhelming. Sullivan had risked his career to help her disappear, and her exposure would inevitably result in consequences for him as well. Emma's first instinct was to run, to disappear again, and hope that she could stay ahead of Shadow Guard resources long enough to find permanent sanctuary somewhere beyond their reach. But 2 years of normal life had created connections and responsibilities. That made immediate flight more complicated than it would have been in her previous existence. Her Aunt Sarah, the art teacher Mr. Peterson, even the routine of school and community that had given structure to her carefully constructed identity. Abandoning all of it felt like another kind of death. More importantly, Emma had learned something about herself during her time at Riverside Valley High School. The person she had become while living as Emma Rodriguez wasn't entirely a fiction. The artistic abilities, the desire for peaceful normalcy, the capacity for genuine human connection, these aspects of her personality were real, not just convenient elements of a cover identity. The thought of returning to the shadows permanently felt like betraying the growth and self-discovery she had achieved during her experiment in normal life. The decision crystallized during her lunch period, as Emma sat in the abandoned art room that had become her sanctuary over the past 2 years. She was sketching absent-mindedly, her hands moving automatically while her mind processed the implications of the shadow guard's attention, when she realized that she was no longer willing to define herself entirely by her training and past experiences. Emma Rodriguez might have been a constructed identity, but she had become real through 2 years of living, growing, and discovering aspects of herself that had nothing to do with combat training or covert operations. The shy art student who preferred solitude and creative expression was as much a part of her true identity as Nightingale, the elite operative who could neutralize threats with surgical precision. The challenge was finding a way to integrate both aspects of herself without destroying everything she had built or putting innocent people at risk. Emma needed to confront the shadow guard on her own terms, resolving the situation in a way that would allow her to maintain some version of the life she had created while addressing their legitimate security concerns. That evening, Emma made her way to the old industrial district near Miller's Creek, an area of abandoned warehouses and empty lots that provided the kind of isolated environment suitable for clandestine meetings. She had chosen the location carefully, identifying multiple escape routes and defensive positions, while ensuring that any confrontation would occur far from innocent bystanders who might be endangered by shadow guard operations. The warehouse she selected had been abandoned for years, its broken windows and rusted infrastructure providing perfect cover for the kind of conversation that couldn't take place in more civilized surroundings. Emma arrived early, using her training to sweep the area for surveillance equipment and establish tactical advantages that might be useful if negotiations failed to produce a peaceful resolution. She didn't have to wait long. Agent Marcus Sullivan emerged from the shadows with the kind of silent approach that had made him one of the Shadow Guard's most effective operatives, his presence both familiar and deeply unsettling. He looked older than Emma remembered, his dark hair now showing silver at the temples and his face carrying lines that suggested the weight of difficult decisions and impossible responsibilities. "Hello, Nightingale," Sullivan said, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and disappointment that struck Emma like a physical blow. "You've been difficult to find. We were beginning to think our initial assessment was correct, and you really had died in that climbing accident." Emma studied her former handler with the kind of careful assessment she had been trained to apply to potential threats, noting the way he positioned himself to block the most obvious escape route while maintaining a non-aggressive posture that suggested he was hoping for cooperation rather than confrontation. His clothing was casual but practical, and she could see the subtle bulges that indicated concealed weapons and communication equipment. "I did die," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil of facing someone who had once been the most important person in her world. "Nightingale died in Switzerland 3 years ago. The person you're looking at now is Emma Rodriguez, and she's not interested in rejoining an organization that trains children to kill people." Sullivan's expression softened slightly at her words, revealing the genuine affection and concern that had made him such an effective mentor during her Shadow Guard training. But Emma could also see the professional calculation behind his emotional response, the way he was evaluating her words and behavior for signs of how she might respond to different approaches. "I know what you think happened in Switzerland," Sullivan said carefully, his tone suggesting that he was prepared to have a conversation that had been 3 years in the making. "But you don't have all the information about that mission or its aftermath. The Shadow Guard made mistakes, and you paid the price for decisions that should never have been your responsibility to make." Emma felt her carefully maintained composure falter slightly at Sullivan's admission. For 3 years, she had carried the guilt and self-doubt that came from believing her moment of hesitation had caused Maria Santos to be wounded and the mission to fail catastrophically. The suggestion that there might be more to the story than she had been told was both intriguing and deeply unsettling. "What are you talking about?" Emma asked, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. The Shadow Guard's version of events had been devastating enough. Learning that she had been manipulated or deceived would add layers of betrayal that might be impossible to process. Sullivan moved closer, his expression becoming more serious as he prepared to share information that Emma suspected would change everything she thought she knew about her past. The kidnapping attempt on Maria Santos wasn't a surprise, Emma. We knew it was coming days before it happened. The Shadow Guard leadership decided to use it as a training exercise, a way to test your capabilities under real-world pressure. The words hit Emma like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the possibility that the worst failure of her young life had been orchestrated by the people she had trusted most completely. The guilt and self-doubt that had driven her to abandon her previous existence suddenly seemed like reactions to a lie, emotional manipulation designed to serve the Shadow Guard's interests rather than reflect the reality of what had occurred. "You used me," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper as she processed the implications of Sullivan's revelation. "You used both of us. Maria could have been killed because you wanted to see how I would perform under pressure." Sullivan's expression showed genuine regret, but also the kind of professional detachment that suggested he had made peace with decisions that had cost innocent people their safety and security. The Shadow Guard has always operated under the principle that training must reflect real-world conditions to be effective. We believe that controlled exposure to genuine danger would make you a more capable operative in the long term. Emma felt something inside her break at those words, a final connection to her past life, severing with the kind of finality that made it impossible to return to who she had been before. The Shadow Guard hadn't just trained her to be a killer. They had manipulated her into believing that her moral qualms and emotional responses were weaknesses that needed to be overcome through exposure to increasingly traumatic situations. "And when I refused to continue participating in your training exercises, you decided I was too dangerous to live," Emma said, her voice carrying a note of bitter understanding. "The climbing accident wasn't just a way to help me disappear. It was your first choice for dealing with a problem that couldn't be solved through conventional means." Sullivan's silence was answer enough, confirming Emma's suspicions about how close she had come to being eliminated rather than allowed to escape. The Shadow Guard's willingness to help her fake her death had been motivated by practical considerations, rather than genuine concern for her welfare, a calculated decision that removing her permanently would create more problems than it solved. "The situation has changed," Sullivan said finally, his tone becoming more formal as he shifted from emotional manipulation to straightforward negotiation. "Recent events have made it clear that your disappearance created security vulnerabilities that need to be addressed. We need you to come back, Emma. The Shadow Guard has evolved since you left, and we believe you would find our current operations more aligned with your moral principles." Emma almost laughed at the absurdity of the suggestion, recognizing the Singwa recruitment pitch for what it was, another attempt to manipulate her emotions and exploit her desire to find meaning and purpose in her existence. The Shadow Guard hadn't changed. They were simply offering her a different version of the same fundamental betrayal of her humanity and autonomy. "I'm not Nightingale anymore," Emma said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet certainty that suggested she had finally found solid ground after years of confusion and self-doubt. "I'm not the traumatized child you recruited and trained to be your weapon. I've learned what it means to be a normal person, to have normal relationships, to care about things that have nothing to do with violence and manipulation." Sullivan's expression hardened as he realized that emotional appeals and revelations about past deceptions weren't going to achieve the result he had been hoping for. The conversation was shifting from recruitment to threat assessment and to Emma. could see him calculating the risks and benefits of allowing her to continue existing outside shadow guard control. "You know, we can't just let you walk away," Sullivan said, his voice taking on the kind of professional edge that suggested negotiations were coming to an end. "Your knowledge of our operations and personnel makes you a security risk that can't be ignored. If you won't come back voluntarily, we'll have to consider other options." Emma had been expecting this moment since she first noticed the surveillance, and she was prepared for it in ways that would have surprised her former handler. 2 years of normal life hadn't made her soft or unprepared. It had given her something worth fighting for that was more powerful than any training the Shadow Guard had ever provided. "I figured you'd say something like that," Emma replied, her voice remaining calm despite the deadly implications of Sullivan's threat. "Which is why I've already taken steps to ensure that eliminating me would be more trouble than it's worth." Emma reached into her jacket pocket, moving slowly to avoid triggering Sullivan's defensive reflexes, and produced a sealed envelope that she placed on a broken concrete ledge between them. The envelope contained copies of documents that would be automatically distributed to multiple media outlets and law enforcement agencies if she failed to check in at regular intervals. A dead man switch that would expose Shadow Guard operations if anything happened to her. "Insurance policy," Emma explained, noting the way Sullivan's expression shifted as he processed the implications of her preparation. "Detailed information about Shadow Guard personnel, training methods, funding sources, and operational history. Everything gets released automatically if I disappear or die under suspicious circumstances." Sullivan stared at the envelope with the kind of professional appreciation that suggested he recognized both the elegance and effectiveness of Emma's strategy. The Shadow Guard's greatest strength had always been their anonymity and exposure would destroy their ability to operate effectively regardless of any other considerations. "You've been busy," Sullivan said, his tone carrying a note of pride that suggested he was genuinely impressed by Emma's tactical thinking. "This is exactly the kind of strategic planning we tried to teach you during your training. You've learned well." Emma felt a moment of satisfaction at her former mentor's approval, but she quickly reminded herself that Sullivan's emotional responses were probably as calculated as everything else about Shadow Guard operations. The pride and affection he was displaying could be genuine, but they were also tools designed to influence her decisions and behavior. "I learned that the most important battles are the ones you win without fighting," Emma said, quoting one of Sullivan's own lessons from her training days. "You taught me that, remember? The best operatives are the ones who can achieve their objectives through preparation and psychology rather than violence." Sullivan nodded slowly, recognizing his own words being used against him in a way that demonstrated how completely Emma had internalized the strategic thinking he had tried to teach her. The student had indeed learned well, perhaps too well for the Shadow Guard's current interests. "So what happens now?" Sullivan asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity about how Emma planned to resolve a situation that seemed to have no clear solution. "You can't stay in Millbrook forever, and we can't ignore your existence indefinitely. Eventually, something has to give." Emma had been thinking about exactly that question for weeks, ever since she first realized that her cover identity was no longer sustainable. The answer she had reached was radical but logical, based on her growing understanding of what she truly wanted from life and what she was willing to sacrifice to achieve it. "I graduate from Riverside Valley High School," Emma said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet determination that suggested she had thought through every aspect of her plan. "I go to college somewhere far from here, preferably on the East Coast. I study art and psychology and maybe some other things that interest me. I build a normal life with normal relationships and normal problems." Sullivan's expression suggested that he was waiting for the other shoe to drop, recognizing that Emma's plan couldn't be as simple as she was making it sound. The Shadow Guard wouldn't simply allow a former operative to disappear into college. Life without addressing the security concerns that had brought them to this confrontation in the first place. And in exchange, Emma continued, addressing Sullivan's unspoken concerns, I provide consultation services on a strictly voluntary basis. If the shadow guard encounters situations that require my specific expertise or perspective, I'll consider helping out. Remote assistance only, no field operations, no training of new recruitives, and absolutely no missions that involve violence against innocent people. The proposal was elegant in its simplicity. Offering the shadow guard continued access to Emma's capabilities while allowing her to maintain the autonomy and normal life she had fought so hard to build. It also provided a face-saving solution that would allow both parties to claim victory while avoiding the mutually destructive consequences of continued conflict. Sullivan considered the proposal for several long minutes, his expression showing the kind of careful calculation that suggested he was evaluating it from multiple angles. Emma could see him working through the implications and potential complications, assessing whether the shadow guard's leadership would accept such an arrangement. It could work, Sullivan said finally, his tone suggesting cautious optimism. There would have to be safeguards, protocols for communication, and security verification. And the insurance policy you've created would need to be maintained on both sides, mutual assured destruction rather than unilateral threats. Emma nodded her agreement, recognizing that trust between them would have to be rebuilt, gradually through demonstrated reliability rather than grand gestures or emotional appeals. The relationship would be fundamentally different from what it had been during her training days, based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than the authority and dependence that had characterized their previous interactions. There's one more thing, Emma said, her voice becoming more serious, as she addressed the issue that had been weighing most heavily on her mind. What happened at school a few weeks ago? There are people who know more about my capabilities than they should. If the shadow guard decides to clean up loose ends by eliminating witnesses, our deal is off and everything gets released immediately. Sullivan's expression showed that he had anticipated this concern, recognizing that Emma's integration into normal teenage life would inevitably create complications that traditional shadow guard security protocols weren't designed to handle. The challenge would be protecting operational security while respecting Emma's emotional connections to her civilian life. Understood, Sullivan said, his tone carrying the kind of professional certainty that suggested he was making a binding commitment. No action against anyone connected to your current life unless they pose a direct and immediate threat to shadow guard operations. Your classmates and teachers are off limits. Emma felt a weight lift from her shoulders at Sullivan's assurance. Knowing that Torai, Tyler, and Madison would be safe from the kind of preemptive elimination that might have been considered necessary under traditional shadow guard security protocols. Their knowledge of her capabilities was dangerous but manageable, especially if they continued to believe that keeping quiet was in their own best interests. Then I think we have a deal, Emma said, extending her hand to Sullivan with the kind of formal gesture that seemed appropriate for concluding negotiations that would determine the course of her future life. Emma Rodriguez graduates from high school, goes to college, and builds a normal life. Nightingale provides occasional consultation to the shadow guard on a voluntary basis. Everyone wins. Sullivan shook her hand, his grip carrying the kind of firm certainty that suggested he was genuinely committed to making their arrangement work. The conversation had accomplished more than either of them had expected when it began, creating a framework for coexistence that respected both Emma's desire for autonomy and the shadow guard's legitimate security concerns. As they prepared to part ways, Emma realized that she felt genuinely hopeful about her future for the first time since the confrontation behind the gymnasium. The integration of her two identities, the skilled operative and the normal teenager, might actually be possible with the right support and understanding from both sides. The following morning, Emma walked into Riverside Valley High School with her head held high and her shoulders straight. no longer hiding behind the carefully constructed vulnerability that had protected her for 2 years. She was still Emma Rodriguez, the girl who loved art and preferred quiet spaces to crowded social scenes. But she was also someone who knew exactly what she was capable of, and wasn't afraid to defend herself or others when the situation required it. The whispers and curious glances that followed her through the hallways no longer seemed threatening or unwelcome. Instead, they felt like recognition of her authentic self, acknowledgement that she was someone worth knowing rather than someone to be overlooked or dismissed. Emma had finally found a way to be both strong and normal, both capable and peaceful. During lunch, she made her way to the art room where Mr. Peterson was setting up supplies for his afternoon classes. The space that had been her sanctuary for 2 years now felt like the beginning of something new rather than a hiding place from the complexities of real life. "Emma," Mr. Peterson said, looking up from his preparation with genuine warmth, "I've been meaning to talk to you about college applications. Have you given any thought to what you'd like to study? Your portfolio is really exceptional, and I think you'd do well at some of the better art schools." Emma smiled, feeling genuinely excited about the future for the first time in years. The conversation about college that had once seemed impossible, due to her uncertain identity and security concerns, now felt like a natural next step in a life that was finally moving forward rather than simply surviving from day to day. "I've been thinking about art therapy," Emma said, the words feeling right as she spoke them. "Combining artistic expression with psychology to help people work through trauma and difficult experiences. I think I might have some insights that could be useful in that field." Mr. Peterson's face lit up with enthusiasm, recognizing the potential in Emma's combination of artistic talent and what he assumed was natural empathy and emotional intelligence. He had no way of knowing that her insights into trauma and recovery came from first-hand experience with both inflicting and healing psychological wounds. As Emma discussed her college plans with Mr. Peterson, she caught sight of Tori Matthews walking past the art room doorway. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Emma saw something she had never expected to see in her former tormentor's expression: respect. Not fear, not resentment, but genuine acknowledgement of Emma as an equal rather than a victim. The moment passed quickly, but it represented everything that Emma had gained through her decision to stop hiding and start integrating her various identities into something authentic and sustainable. She was no longer pretending to be helpless, but she also wasn't defined entirely by her capacity for violence. She was simply Emma Rodriguez, a complicated person with an unusual background who was working to build a life that honored all aspects of who she had become. That afternoon, as Emma walked home from school through the familiar streets of Millbrook, she allowed herself to feel genuinely optimistic about what lay ahead. College would bring new challenges and opportunities, but she would face them as her authentic self rather than as someone playing a role designed to hide from the world. The Shadow Guard would always be part of her history, and her connection to Agent Sullivan and the organization that had shaped her youth would continue in a limited capacity. But Emma had finally found a way to move forward without abandoning either her past or her dreams for the future. She was no longer Nightingale, the elite operative who lived in the shadows. She was no longer just Emma Rodriguez, the vulnerable art student who hid from conflict. She was both and neither, someone entirely new who had learned to integrate strength and gentleness, capability and creativity into an identity that was uniquely her own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.